Hello, welcome to lesson 5 in our Renaissance unit. So this will be our third lesson this week, not due until Monday of next week. Then we have 3 more lessons next week before we get to your final test just over the Renaissance. So remember, there's not a final over the whole semester, it's just a final over the Renaissance. Now, we had spent time discussing, all the steps up to the Renaissance, the path of light to darkness, intellectually, again, not spiritually. And eventually it goes into spiritually because of the Reformation. We'll mention that a little bit in our last presentation next week. All right, so dealing with the Renaissance, we're going to move kind of fast today just because we got to get into the authors and then the artists before we get through with this. And you will have some episodes, or not episodes, but video clips that you will have to watch of some of the Shakespearean plays and everything. So that will start next week. So what we're going to be dealing with after these steps, we've got to the point of the Renaissance. Now we're going to deal with the key elements of the Renaissance that made it so big and so successful as far as changing human thought process. Okay? So what we're going to get to today is, first of all, is dealing with the elements of the Renaissance. What made it different than the Middle Ages? And the first one is they began to focus on the individual rather than the group. Remember, everything was about the manor. Everything dealt with the manor house and the Lord, and everything belonged to him, and everyone was living in a communal situation, and so it was about the group. And then they go off and they go to the Crusades, things begin to splinter and spread apart, and now people are more concerned about themselves instead of the group. So that's a big emphasis or change that happened in society. And then life was so bad during the Middle Ages, and we talked about the life expectancy was short. And then on top of that, there wasn't just a lot to look forward to except heaven itself, because there was nothing getting ready to happen in life that was something for them to look for except for the feast that happened during the course of the year. Or if there was a wedding for the manor house or something of that nature, then there was a lot of big things that they could look forward to. But life itself, there was just nothing to look forward to, so it was a heavenly minded, tolerate life. Now, heaven will come eventually, but while I'm here on this earth, I'm going to live it to the most. And I'm going to get as much out of this life, and I'm going to live the way I want to. And that's kind of the thought process that began to happen. So the hearty zest for life now. And then future would take care of itself. So they changed the idea, whatever's going to happen, it happens. It's my destiny, it's fate, whatever you want to call it. And so their attitude began to change from, I need to prepare for the future, I need to prepare for the next life, to I'm going to live right now, and whatever happens, happens. Okay? So these are different things that began to really change the thought process and the attitude during the time of the Renaissance. And they began to emphasize individual ability. What are your abilities, and build on those, and dignity, using them properly. So that's actually a good thing, where we focus on what we're able to do and how that can contribute to the community or to society itself. And we need to be thinking that right now, because each of us have gifts. And one of the things that we learn, especially from 1 Corinthians chapter 12, is God's given us gifts. And I think Ephesians chapter 4, God has given us gifts, and we are to use those gifts for the betterment of the body. Our gifts are not used for our benefit, they're used for the benefit of others. And so that's something we need to keep in mind, and we need to use it properly, because remember, right after 1 Corinthians chapter 12, when it talks about gifts, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 talks about love. So we need to do it appropriately, with dignity, but more importantly, with love. All right, the next element that comes into play are schools of thought. Now, we talked about scholasticism. So in those early years, in the 11th to 12th century, the universities that rise, they dealt with scholasticism, which was, basically defending church dogma with reason and logic. Well, they began to go away from that, and they began to teach not church doctrine, but that was the church's responsibility, and the church's institutions, these secular institutions, we need to teach other things. So humanism began to rise. Now, it's not the humanism that we think of today, okay? Emphasis on man's abilities and classical learning. Classical learning dealt with learning Greek and Latin, and the literature that comes out of those time periods, and any other older literature works that they have in their own language. But classical learning basically deals with the rhetoric learning about language, how language fits together, how powerful language can be, how to debate, how to argue, these types of things, and then also learning it in Latin and in Greek. So that's basically what humanism was. It's not without God as it is today. And then the next one is humanities. The study of humanities is a liberal arts education. It still is today. So if you go to a college, you major in humanities, it's basically a well-rounded liberal arts education. As a matter of fact, when I was in college, they would tell you if you don't know what you want to major in humanities, because from humanities, you can go into any master level program. Okay? And you study history, science, grammar, classical literature, and philosophy. So it's a well-rounded, and it still gets into math a little bit, but mostly it's into those categories. So these are the school of thought. So we go from a scholasticism to humanism and humanities type of program. All right? Next thing is we get into the idea of patrons. A patron is someone who financially sponsors someone else, a sponsor or benefactor for artists. Now remember, all art that came out during the time of the Middle Ages and even before the time of the Middle Ages, once the church came into power, all art dealt with religious situations, religious themes. There was not a lot of portraits done unless you were royalty. There were not nature portraits. They were either historical or they were church. And most of them were church history. Okay? So these are the different things. And one of the big patrons that came out during this time is called, from the De Medici family, okay, from Florence. And they were really into money and banking and commerce, okay? And this is Lorenzo. There is a show on Netflix right now called The Medici Family, or about the Medicis. It's kind of over the top in some aspects. I've never watched it. I've just heard it's not something you really want to watch because it gets into a lot of inappropriate things. Okay, but there was a TV show on, and some of you watched it. It was on Netflix called REN, and it dealt with Mary, Queen of Scots, when she was married to briefly the King of France, and then he died from disease, and then she went back eventually to Scotland. And then that's a whole nother story, fascinating story about her life. But with her, one of the things that you see is her mother-in-law, who was the mother of the King of France and was married to the King of France, is Catherine de Medici. She was from that same family, and she was considered one of the most powerful women in Europe because she was so connected financially because of the de Medici family. And Lorenzo is called the Magnificent because he did so much for the art. So you see people starting to hire artists to not paint religious works, but to paint nature, to paint portraits, to sculpt anything that they wanted. And they started saying, come live with us, we'll take care of you. And that's why some of these great Renaissance artists were so successful, because they had patrons who took care of them and paid for them. Because no one before this time really made money off of art. And so the de Medici family was into banking and commerce, and they just made a lot of money off of that. Okay? And then Florence became the most influential city of the time, and the reason is because of the trade. So Florence, like we talked about the Venetians before, basically a lot of trade, and they were making a lot of money through this. So this is one of the main patrons of this time, and he's the one that we use for an example and why the artists and even the writers were so successful. And the other thing that he was known for, it's not the first library in the world, but it is the first public library. Libraries were always built for royalty, for scholars at the time. But now he's building a library because so many more people can read, but they don't have anything to read. They can't afford to buy their own books. So he wanted to create a library where people could come and borrow a book, read it, and then bring it back and get another one. So they didn't have to house this huge collection of their own library. So he not only donated the money, the spot, he also donated a lot of books from their personal collection to help start this first library. And that's why he's called the Magnificent. Okay? And then we're going to get into some important writers. Okay? And we're just going to talk about the first one today, and then we'll finish up the rest of them on our next lesson, lesson 6. Okay? But the first one is the important writers of the Renaissance, and we deal with Petrarch. Okay? And he's called the Prince of Humanism. So remember, we have the Prince of Schoolmen, dealing with Sir Thomas Aquinas. Now you have the Prince of Humanism, which is Petrarch, a new school of philosophy that was coming, a new way of teaching. And this is him here. He's considered the first modern poet. He also perfected the sonnet. And we see that even brought to a higher level with the writings of Shakespeare during the Elizabethan age in England. Okay, and he's the one that basically kicked it all off and renewed interest in the classics. The classics back then, going all the way back to Homer and his writings and some of the other ones. Okay.
To you.
This is my birthday.